All right, let's get started. Welcome to today's webinar from Firetail. We are going to discuss API Discovery today. I am the host of today's webinar, Jeremy Snyder. I'm one of the co-founders here at Firetail. API Discovery is a topic that comes up in many conversations with pretty much every organization that we talk to. This question of discovering APIs and figuring out what APIs we either have defined or are already running is a constant source of concern and is a pretty much the first step in most conversations towards an API security strategy. So just a little bit about me before we get going here. I have been in the IT and cyber security space for the better part of 30 years at this point. A little bit crazy to say that out loud. It's actually just kind of hitting me as we sit here today. But I've spent the last half of my career really focused in kind of customer-facing roles with both services and software companies, and I spent the first half of my career as really a hands-on keyboard practitioner and then leader of IT and cybersecurity teams. So we've got a little bit of a shorter webinar today, and we're going to be jumping back and forth between a little bit of presentation and a little bit of product demo. And we thought it would be useful to really take the time today to cover the depth of use cases around API discovery that we have in the Firetail platform, talk a little bit about the importance of each and how altogether this all kind of comes together and forms, again, a very cohesive end-to-end approach to discovering APIs across different environments. So with that said, we're going to go just very quickly over a little bit of the background of Firetail, our philosophy, our reason for being, and why we're trying to solve the problem that we are trying to solve regarding API security. And then we're going to talk about the 5 different methods that we have in Firetail for finding APIs. And I know 5 sounds like a lot, but it's a little bit of our view as to organizations may want to start this API security strategy or this API security journey from many different perspectives. Some will want to start with a secure by design approach where they really focus on, let's say, what you'll hear as a buzzword, shift left, looking for APIs in code and looking to do things with those APIs before they get out into production. And others, might be teams that come into a pre-existing environment and they're trying to wrap their heads around it and understand what's going on. Also, we have customers that come to us from cloud environments and then customers that are more on-prem. And so there's a little bit of a balance there in terms of different tools that you can use for different environments. We're going to go through all of those with a little bit more detail shortly here as we get going. And then one of the other things that I want to kind of wrap today's webinar on is something called API Spec Generation. API specifications, for those that don't know, are extremely valuable if you are trying to wrap your head around an environment that you've inherited and you're trying to understand, okay, what does each of these APIs do? What are the different, let's say, routes, methods, endpoints exposed by each API? We're going to go through some of that as well. So let's start with a little bit of the approach and the philosophy that we have here at Firetail. So first, our reason for being, we're really trying to help organizations understand their APIs, understand the risks that each API could pose to an organization and to the data that the organization owns. And we really started the Firetail journey by analyzing the API data breaches that have happened in the real world and figuring out the root causes of those. And for those who maybe haven't looked at our content in the past, I would just encourage you to go look at the API data breach tracker that we have on our website. You can find that from a link in the footer of really any page on the site. We also have an API security report that we prepare annually. We've done this for the last couple of years. You should be able to find, I think, the 2024 version definitely as of May this year. You can find last year's version as well if you're curious and take the 2 side by side and kind of look at a comparison. This year's report was actually pretty interesting because we did also some external real world analysis of publicly listed and publicly exposed APIs. And we also did some analysis of traffic trends and attack trends that we're seeing from our own customer base. So have a look at that. All of that is designed to inform, again, the way that we build Firetail, some of the features that we put into the platform, et cetera. And, our view on APIs is that traditional security approaches don't really work. So if you look at things like web application firewalls, or you look at let's say like just using an API gateway, or if you look at just a vulnerability management program, these things will often, give you either not the level of support that you need, or sometimes even a false sense of security that you have the support. So we really focus on kind of a data-driven design approach, again, working backwards from the analysis of the real-world breaches. One common thread across all of that is, like I kind of hinted at the beginning, discovery as the first starting point for really any API security journey. And second, end-to-end, because you might have to start that journey anywhere, depending on where your organization's, where your organization's at. That could be, again, starting from a shift left, we're looking at our code, or that could be more like looking at a pre-existing cloud environment that you have to look at. So code to cloud, end to end, these are all things that are very much in our ethos here, and that we're trying to make sure that customers can engage with Firetail and start that journey from any point that they're at. Okay, so like I said, first question, and really in any security thing, but especially in API security, is really establishing visibility. One of the challenges around APIs is that they can run on many different types of compute infrastructure with many different network configurations. We actually had a blog post about this recently. If you're interested, have a look at the Firetail blog, look for something called The Problem with APIs. And it really describes why, for some organizations, it's so challenging to start this process. And again, why it's so hard to discover APIs. They can be on virtual machines, they can be in containers, they can be in serverless functions, they could be behind API gateways, load balancers, or they could be behind none of those things, right? And so sometimes it's really challenging to find them. And that is, again, why this question of visibility is pretty much always the starting point, and why it's so crucial to start at that point. So let's talk through the 5 types of API discovery that we had. And like I said, we're going to jump back and forth a little bit between kind of descriptions that we have here in this slide deck, and then through some of the products. So let's start with API discovery from cloud. So in Firetail, in Firetail, our view is that it should be as quick and easy as possible to get visibility onto APIs in your cloud environment. We support AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. We use something called an IAM, or Identity and Access Management role, with a trust relationship established between Firetail and your cloud environment. This is a very common approach used by pretty much any SaaS vendor who is providing some type of software or data analysis on top of cloud platforms. We use a read-only role. So that's important to know. When we are querying your AWS, Azure, GCP environment, Firetail cannot modify anything in that environment. We do have automated deployments available for AWS and a little bit for Google, a little bit less available on the Microsoft Azure side. We'll go through this a little bit. And pretty much for those that are kind of interested in the technical aspects of it, the way that we discover these APIs is through a network layer infrastructure inspection. So let's jump into that. Let's have a look, and let's kind of start that demo. So I'm just going to jump over here into the Firetail integrations. And what you'll see here is that we've got a few different categories of integration. I went ahead and selected the discovery category. And sure enough, here we see, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. I'm going to start with AWS, and then I'll quickly talk through the other ones as well. So when we look at the Microsoft AWS deployment here, what we can see is that we've got a CloudFormation prompt here. If we can just click that, this will redirect you to log into your AWS account. It will deploy a CloudFormation template. And all you really have to do is give a descriptor here. So Firetail API Discovery on our AWS account. Once you run that CloudFormation template, it's going to give you a role ARN, and it's going to prompt you to select the different AWS regions that you would like to discover APIs in. You might actually want to go down this list and select everything, or you might actually know that you have service control policies or other account restrictions where, let's say, maybe you only use certain regions as a rule. That's up to you how you want to do that. One last thing to mention here is that when you discover APIs from an external source, Firetail uses the concept of an application. An application is a group of APIs. And what we tend to find in working with customers is that basically there is a there is a common approach of using an AWS account as a application container. And so very often this will be something like, our AWS production account is something that you would want to maybe call that. You will need to either have that, or you can just very simply click here, our AWS prod account for the application name. One other thing to note here is that Firetail uses the concept of API owners. Owners are typically, the people that are responsible for it. So I could just put in individuals, or I could put in email addresses. We can use those later on in the platform for various things. You can also apply tags here if you want to do things like, let's say, cloud AWS and, environment prod. These are, again, useful for scoping later on. These little checkboxes here, as we discover APIs, if we set both of those on, these tags will be applied to any of the APIs discovered. Again, just to confirm here, Firetail is read-only access to your cloud environment. So any of this tag propagation will only be within Firetail. So this is for use within Firetail. These tags will not get pushed back to your AWS environment. All right, so we can go ahead and submit that. And then we can, populate the ARN, choose our regions, click submit, etc. Now, under the hood, what's happening here? So it is creating an IAM role. It is then using the security auditor permission in order to connect. And there are a couple of additional permissions that are requested here. You can simply copy paste, drop those in to the permissions policy, where you add this inline policy that allows for a little bit more. So what you're going to do is then populate that, click next, etc. That's going to create the role directly, and then you're going to copy paste the ARN. So it's effectively the same thing as the CloudFormation template. You're ending up with the same data. This is just the manual steps if you prefer to do it that way. And also for those of you who want to understand exactly what's happening underneath the covers here, behind the scenes, so to speak. Firetail is effectively looking at API gateways, load balancers of all types. So that is both classic application and network load balancers, and then web application firewalls. And then in the case of AWS, there's two additional services that Firetail looks at. One is Lambdas, which are serverless containers, and the other is AppSync, which is a native GraphQL service on top of that. And so for all of these, this is a read-only allow action that you're looking for here. Great. In the case of Azure, the functionality is largely the same. The actual deployment mechanism is slightly different. Azure uses something called application registrations, where you need to fetch the tenant ID and client ID. I will just point out the documentation for all of these is linked directly from the integration page. So if we follow that link, that'll take us directly over to some documentation that explains the Azure API integration scanning, and it'll show you where you can find all of the different credentials within your Azure environment. Okay, great. So you would go through that same process, populate these different fields with the data fetched from your Azure environment. We are, again, using a similar type of approach. You'll notice that it is a reader role looking at those different services. Azure doesn't separate the different service type permissions as granularly as AWS. So this is the role that you need here. And then finally, in the case of Google Cloud Platform, you've got access that you can set up in the Google Cloud project using the CLI commands here. So this runs in the Google Shell terminal. If you have a look here a little bit, you'll notice that it's creating a service account and an IAM binding to that service account on the project ID. And if you wanted to understand, again, exactly what's going on here, the manual steps here will kind of show you, if you're using more of a ClickOps approach, what sets of permissions you need to add here. And you'll notice that it is, again, API gateway. We support both the native GCP as well as Apigee. Also then the compute network, and that looks for APIs through the network layer. And then a workload identity user, which helps to provision the read-only access, as well as to grant us the query rights to inspect all of those different things. Provider ID and the AWS account field for the cross-cloud trust relationship are right here in these steps. And then these other mappings need to go in here as well. All right, so that is the API discovery through the 3 different cloud providers. Hopefully that all makes sense. And I'll just kind of show you what that looks like in Firetail. And so if we jump over into Firetail, you'll notice that at the top level, we've got APIs. And I've just pre-filtered this down to our 3 different cloud providers. I'm just going to take a quick second to highlight a couple of things on what Firetail finds when you go through that discovery process. So I'll just pick this one as an example here. So a couple of things. First of all, you'll notice I'm just going to jump right over here into the details. What you've got here is you've got all of the metadata that Firetail discovers. And so that's going to be exposed endpoints. That's going to be right down to URLs and direct pop out here if you want to actually go explore them. We won't talk about it in today's webinar, but there is also the possibility to initiate some scans of those directly upon discovery. So if you wanted to scan these APIs externally, we have an action system for that. We're not going to cover it in today's webinar, but the details, all the metadata is discovered here. The different stages, this is a little bit unique to the API gateway construct within AWS, but if there are stages, they are going to be discovered. And then again, API spec files. So if a cloud network type or a cloud resource allows for the storage of the API spec file, we will go ahead and pull that back, allow you to discover all of the different routes methods, and you can explore that either in kind of a simplified view, or you can explore it in a Swagger UI view where you can really look at all of the different request body examples and formatting required, etc. All right, so that is on the cloud provider API discovery side. Hopefully that all makes sense. If there's any questions, please just reach out to us afterwards. I think we need to move on. So the next one that I wanted to highlight is API discovery from security tools. So currently we only support Wiz for this functionality, but we also have the ability to enrich data back to Wiz. We do support Splunk for sending data onwards, and there's a couple other security tools and ticketing tools that we support for sending data onwards. We will be expanding this capability to support other third-party tools, but let's dive in and have a look at what that looks like. So on the Wiz API inventory scanning and enrichment, you'll notice that that's the name. Very similar, again, we want to say scan Wiz scan for APIs. What's important to note is you actually have to work with both platforms on this side. So you need to log into Wiz, go through the setup guide, which is again documented here. As you do that, you'll get your Wiz GraphQL endpoint, and then the Amazon Cognito is the default provider here, but it is the Wiz auth provider that you need to use. You may see this from your Wiz documentation in the settings on your Wiz account. You'll also fetch your client ID and your client secret, drop those in here. And then one last thing to note here, and this is pretty powerful and pretty interesting. And again, we've got a nice blog post on our site about APIs and the hidden attack path. If you're looking for more information on that, just turn this to on, and we will then provide some nice feedback into the Wiz platform that allows you to see vulnerabilities on the API within the Wiz platform, as well as malicious traffic against that. So what does that end up looking like in practice? So when we look, if we jump back into our API inventory, you'll notice here that we've got different APIs discovered via Wiz. I'm just going to pick one here. Interesting to note here is that we get the same details around, let's say, the endpoint, the cloud provider region, et cetera. All of that we do get out of Wiz. Unfortunately, we're not able to pull the specifications. Wiz doesn't store them, so we're not able to pull those out. So if you want to kind of analyze this API with a little bit more depth, you may want to go through a little bit of a secondary process to connect this API to Firetail directly. That will allow us to do a little bit better on the risk scoring and provide that back to Wiz. All right. So that's the second method, API discovery from other discovery tools. Other security tools. We've got third and fourth methods that I'm going to talk about kind of together, and then we're going to jump into the platform and look at them together. So one of the other ways that Firetail can discover APIs is through plugins to common third-party open source proxies. So there's a couple that we support today, 3 that we support today, Nginx, KrakenD, and API 6. They use a plugin or integration architecture. These are open source. They're freely available on our GitHub. You can see the URL right there. They do a couple of things. So they will help discover the APIs, send information about the APIs back to the Firetail platform. They will actually fetch API specifications. They can provide inline blocking that is configurable for most of the plugins. And last but not least, they actually send logs to Firetail, which are very rich logs that can be used for analyzing API traffic and more. Similarly, we have code libraries that you can embed into your applications. We support a few different code languages here, Python, Go, Ruby, and Node.js. These use more of a middleware architecture or a middleware approach. We will be rolling out other languages over time. Also open source, also available on our GitHub. Very similar functionality to the plugins. They do inline blocking and logging support. So let's have a look at those. So if we jump back into Firetail here, and we go onto our integrations page, we go into code libraries, you'll see all of these available to us. So let's just pick one to have a look at here. We're going to pick the Go library as an example here. So you've got direct links into the code repository and the open source stuff. You've got documentation on how to install that. You've got commands here that you can simply copy paste, as well as how you actually integrate this into your application. This is an example of the Open API spec that needs to be, effectively needs to conform to this model in order for the middleware to work properly. Let's have a look at one of the other ones, like on the Nginx side. So here we've got, again, documentation about how to install this, how to download the tarball, configure it, etc. One of the things you'll notice here is the API token. This is actually a little bit counterintuitive, but you need to deploy a token, or potentially counterintuitive. You need to deploy a token from the Firetail platform in order to then drop this into the plugin. And that's the way that Firetail knows to associate any particular API with the with that Nginx or whatever plugin instance it is. Okay, fantastic. So here you see all of these different things. Again, documentation, links directly from the Firetail platform. So let's jump into the platform and have a look at what this looks like in practice. So I'm just going to pick this one as an example here. So we've got this. This is a Python library API. The specification was uploaded via the Firetail library. You'll also notice that the requests, the logs of the requests come back from that. Obviously the API showed up in our inventory. Requests get analyzed a little bit out of the scope of today's webinar, but the combination of the specs and the analysis of the requests together go into informing the risk score of the API. So if you want to have a look at that, that is something you can definitely check out as well. And again, these are open source, so you can play around with them at your leisure. So just going back to the API inventory for a second. Whoops, sorry. So again, we can see like the different kind of code library examples here from the different environments that we've collected from. All right. And then last but definitely not least is API discovery from code repository. So we've gone over 4 different methods. And one thing I should have mentioned just on the last one, let me just go back for a slide. On both the plugins and the code libraries, these are the strategy that most customers and organizations will use for on-prem APIs. So if you're running APIs not in the cloud and you need to figure them out, you will very often be running some kind of proxy or gateway service for those APIs, and that's probably the best way for your on-prem APIs to discover them. Sorry about that. Let's jump back to where we were on the code repository side. So there are one of the last method to look for discovering APIs is via code repository integration. We support both GitHub and GitLab currently at this point, 2 flavors of GitHub. So there is a Docker-based container that you can run for private repositories, And there is also a native GitHub app that is like super simple to deploy against your GitHub repos in order to, say whether you want to scan all repos or some repos. So let's have a look at these, shall we? All right. So let's jump over here back into the Firetail platform. So as I mentioned, we've got kind of two flavors of this. So if we look at the Docker flavor, you can see that you're getting an API Discovery container. You're going to download and run that in your Docker environment. That's going to upload API specs, as well as do static code analysis for the languages that are supported, which is, again, that same list as the Firetail libraries. If we look at repo scanning as a native app, what we're going to see is that we get a pop-up window. And bear with me 1 second here. We're going to get a pop-up window. Sorry, I should have had this prepared in advance, but we get a pop-up window where we put in our two-factor authentication. We choose our code repository, and then we can choose either only certain repositories or we can scan all repositories. Simply click save, and that's going to fire off. As we do that, it's going to then bring those into our Firetail environment, into the inventory. And let's jump back into that. So, all right. So now if we have a look at this, I've just simply filtered this down into all APIs discovered via GitHub or GitLab. What we can see is we've got all of these different APIs. And I'm going to pick one or two examples, one out of each provider, one out of GitLab, one out of GitHub. As we look at these, I think one of the interesting things to see is that the metadata is now a little bit different. So we have pointers to the repositories where the API lives. That allows us to then do some tracking back to the owners of the repositories. Because we are looking at code, very often we will either get a API spec, or we're going to talk about what we can do otherwise instead. And an API risk score should be calculated based off of that as well. So that is the discovery. That's what's going to show up. Let's just have a look real quick at a GitHub example instead. Again, a very similar metadata view as for GitLab, with a repository finder, repository pointer, repository ID, etc. All right, and then what does that bring? That brings us to the end of our 5 different methods of scanning APIs. So let's talk quickly about the next question that very often arises, which is, okay, you've found my APIs. We inherited this environment. We need documentation. We need API specs. So we've got 2 methods of creating specs out of APIs. So one is from logs and the other is from code. So let's talk quickly about that. API specs from logs, this supports AWS, Microsoft Azure, GCP. So if we look at logging connections to the different cloud providers, we can ingest logs from API gateways, load balancers, and more. I should have also mentioned the logs coming in from the code libraries and the proxy plugins. This will also work for those as well, but you'll typically get the API specs already from those, so you may not need to generate these. Logs get enriched and tagged as they are ingested into the Firetail platform. And effectively what this does is it inspects the logs, kind of catalogs them over time, and then reconstructs the API specification based on observed usage. So let's have a look here. I'm just going to jump into this example that we've got. We've got this example where we've got a bunch of logs from the last however many months. You can see the log entries come in here. This is some of the enrichment that I mentioned, the different tags. Also, tags that highlights different security events are kind of surfaced front and center up at the top here. When we jump over into the API specs, of course, this example already has some specs, but we can also look at generating a spec file. So if we look here, we've got this generate specification. This is beta functionality. So there's a little bit of work still going into these before they're fully released to the public, but they are available for testing on our platform already. You'll notice that if we have a quick look in there and we look, we've got different time frames that we can look at. So we can look, what's been observed over the last hour, well, just the health check. But if we amp that up to the last 90 days, we see that we actually get a pretty complete spec based on the observed traffic. You can look at that in either JSON or YAML format. You can actually prettify it if you want. I don't know if that works for I think that only works for JSON, but in any event, you can give this a name. I can say this is, pet store API spec generated by Firetail, and then just download that if you like. So all of that is available to you. And if you actually do end up finding a spec file, you can upload it here as well. Let's say you find one from a code repository. So that is API spec generation from logs. And let's go to our very last bit here, which is API spec generation from code. Now, this works for both GitHub and GitLab, and it works for one language in addition to those that we support, Java. We do have other languages coming soon. This is actually AI powered, and this is, again, a new feature that's in beta. We're definitely looking for feedback on this. So if this is something that is of interest to you, please do. Just go ahead and sign up for the free tier, start playing around with it, give us some feedback, let us know what you think. So let's jump in, have a look at what this looks like. So I've just picked a couple of different applications here, and just to kind of highlight, we've got some GitHub, we've got some GitLab. I'm just going to pick this one from the GitHub side, and I jump over here. You'll notice that it's already generated one. So when you're in Firetail, if you ever see a spec that starts with the string static analysis, that means that it was generated by the Firetail AI here. So if you look here, you'll notice that it's captured some routes and methods, etc. And then let's just have a quick look at the other side. And this is coming out of, sorry, I actually meant to choose the other one, coming out of GitLab. So again, pretty similar function. And it's generated a spec file here as well. So fantastic. Hopefully that is helpful. Let's come back and wrap up. So just on the roadmap side, you can certainly expect that we'll continue to build on the functionality that we've already pushed out here. Certainly some references to other code languages that we'll be working on over the near-term future. If you're a user of the Firetail platform, it's a great idea to check in every couple of weeks. We do push out typically every 2 weeks. We'll put out a new release with new product features. Our change log, if that's something you would you could subscribe to and look for changes in that. Our documentation always details it. We do follow a secure software development lifecycle. We are SOC 2 audited. You can get more information about either of those from our team. We tend to document everything that we release. Those are 3 sources of documentation. Firetail.io/docs is probably just the easiest place to start. All right, and just bringing to a close today's webinar. If you're interested in testing out any of this functionality for yourself, just scan that QR code. That'll take you to where you can get started. Just a couple notes. We do offer a free tier. You can find out about that on our website. And we do require a business email address. We also require a complex password and 2-factor authentication. So if you are about to start testing the free tier, have your authenticator app ready. And also be prepared to verify your email. So we do send you a quick email after you've signed up to confirm that it's you, and then prompt you for the authenticator, etc. Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. Hopefully that was helpful. We'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.